They removed the technology that was powering entire cities, buried the evidence in public archives, and then taught every generation after to walk right past it without blinking. And the crazy part is, the proof is still there, sitting in dusty filing cabinets, in city records nobody looks at, in the foundations of buildings you probably pass every day without thinking twice. My name is Daniel, and about 3 years ago, I fell into something I genuinely wish I could unsee. It started the way most strange things start, not with a dramatic revelation, with a number that didn't add up. I was going through old municipal engineering records, the kind of documents that live in archive rooms that smell like old paper and something slightly damp, the kind of rooms where the fluorescent light flickers just enough to make you feel slightly uneasy the whole time you're in there. I was looking for something completely unrelated, a footnote in a building permit from about a century ago, and then I saw a phrase that stopped me cold. Unauthorized resonance infrastructure. I had never seen that phrase in an engineering document before. Not once. So I wrote it down and kept moving. But then I saw it again. Same phrase, different city, different document, different decade, then again after that. By the time I had gone through a reasonable cross-section of records from cities across the country, I had found that exact phrase repeated in removal permits from more than 40 separate locations, all within roughly the same short window of time. Cities with no documented connection to each other, no shared contractor, no shared governing body, no obvious reason to be using identical language in their paperwork. That kind of repetition doesn't happen by accident. When the same unusual phrase shows up in bureaucratic documents across dozens of unconnected cities in the same era, one of two things is true. Either someone told them all to write it, or someone told them all to write it and then made sure it looked like nobody had. I went home that night and did something simple. I pulled up photographs of city skylines from about 100 years ago and compared them to photographs of the same skylines today. I had seen old city photos before, everyone has, but I had never looked at them with this specific question in my head. And when you look with a question, you see things you never noticed before. The old skylines were jagged, densely, almost aggressively jagged. Every significant building bristled with tall metal towers, iron and copper spires rising from rooftops in clusters, some of them reaching extraordinary heights. Not one or two per building, dozens. The overall impression was less of a city and more of something designed to interact with the sky, something that was actively reaching upward for a reason. Then I looked at the same cities today, flat, smooth, clean horizontal lines and glass surfaces. Every single one of those towers gone, replaced by nothing, as if they had simply never existed. I sat with that image for a long time. Because here is the thing about erasure. The most effective kind doesn't leave a visible hole. It doesn't create an obvious absence you can point at. The most effective erasure replaces what was taken with something that looks completely natural, so that within a generation, nobody remembers there was ever anything different. Nobody asks. Nobody wonders. The question never even forms. But the question had formed in my head now, and it wasn't going away. If you're finding this as unsettling as I did, do me a favor and subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps more people find this, and what comes next is where things get really hard to explain away. Because once I started pulling on that thread, the next thing I found wasn't a loose end. It was a whole second layer underneath the first one, and this layer had numbers in it. Specific, documented, publicly available numbers that simply do not work under the official explanation. Not even close. The era I kept coming back to was the period of the great public exhibitions. You know the ones. Massive fairgrounds built to showcase national progress, drawing millions of visitors, filled with enormous temporary structures designed to impress. These fairs were heavily documented: attendance records, construction invoices, engineering specifications, power plant outputs. The paperwork exists, and when you sit down and actually read it, something deeply strange becomes visible. The electricity consumption at these exhibitions was enormous. We're talking about enough power to run a major city on the technology of that era. That level of consumption is documented in multiple independent records, visitor accounts, engineering reports, newspaper coverage. All of it consistently describes a scale of illumination and electrical operation that was genuinely staggering for the time. Here's the problem. The power stations built to supply these fairs had documented maximum output capacities. Those capacities are also on record, and when you put the two numbers next to each other, there is a gap. a significant, unexplained gap between the power that could be generated and the power that was demonstrably being used. No record of additional fuel deliveries large enough to close that gap. No documented backup generation capacity. Just the gap, sitting there in the official record, silent and ignored. Now here is where my hands actually went a little cold on the keyboard, because the invoices for these fairgrounds also document the materials installed beneath them. And buried in those line items, listed matter-of-factly alongside timber and stone and glass, is copper, enormous quantities of it. Precision-graded, carefully specified copper conductor cable, driven deep into the ground beneath buildings that were designed to be torn down within months of opening, not shallow grounding, deep, extending far below what any lightning protection system would require, far below what any structural purpose could justify. Installed before the exhibition halls above them were even framed, as if the underground network had to come first, as if the underground network was the point, and the buildings were built around it afterward. The cost of that copper alone, for temporary structures with a lifespan measured in months, runs into figures that make no sense as a decorative or incidental expense. You don't spend that kind of money on infrastructure you're about to demolish unless the infrastructure is doing something that makes it worth every cent. And when I mapped the locations of those copper networks against the positions of the spires on the buildings above them, the connection became impossible to ignore. Every major spire fed directly into the underground system. They weren't independent decorations. They were the tops of a single integrated structure. Above ground and below ground, reaching up and reaching down at the same time. Which means the question isn't just where the extra power came from. The question is whether those buildings were consuming power at all, or whether they were something else entirely. Something that the word building doesn't quite cover. And the answer to that question is sitting in the geometry of the spires themselves, in a pattern so precise and so deliberately constructed that when I finally understood what I was looking at, I had to stand up and walk around the room for a few minutes just to settle my thoughts. Because this wasn't improvised. This wasn't coincidence. Someone designed these structures to do something very specific, and whatever it was, it worked well enough that someone else spent enormous resources making sure it would never work again. The spires weren't placed randomly. Someone did the math, and when I did the same math, about a century later, sitting at my desk with a cup of coffee that went cold because I forgot it existed, I found something that made the hair on my arms stand up in a way I genuinely was not prepared for. I had been mapping spire configurations, taking the architectural drawings of major civic buildings from that era, the ones that still exist in historical society archives and library special collections, and plotting the positions of their spire systems on graph paper. Not digitally, by hand, because something about physically tracing those lines made the relationships easier to see. And what I kept finding, building after building, was that the spacing between spires was not arbitrary. It was not aesthetic. It followed a precise internal logic that had nothing to do with how the building looked and everything to do with something measurable. When you take those spacing measurements and convert them to wavelength equivalents, the numbers land on a very specific set of frequencies: 7.83 cycles per second, 14.3, 20.8. If those numbers mean nothing to you right now, here is what they are. They are the natural resonant frequencies of the Earth's own electromagnetic field. The frequencies at which the space between the ground and the upper atmosphere vibrates constantly, quietly, invisibly, all the time, everywhere on the planet. Researchers have known about these frequencies for decades. They are well documented and measurable. They are not theoretical. The buildings were tuned to them. Not one building, not a handful. I found the same geometric ratios in a civic library on the East Coast, a government administrative hall in the Midwest, an exhibition palace that had been built and demolished generations ago, but whose blueprints survived in a university collection. Different architects, different decades, different countries, identical proportional relationships between the spire positions, as if all of them had been drawn from the same underlying set of specifications that nobody ever publicly named or credited. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I had to. The conventional story about this era of architecture is that it was driven by individual artistic vision, by the personal ambitions of great designers working independently to create monuments to civic pride. That story has one very specific problem. Individual artistic vision does not produce identical harmonic ratios across dozens of unconnected structures on multiple continents. Coincidence does not do that either. Only a shared blueprint does that. And a shared blueprint means a shared understanding of what the buildings were actually supposed to do. What they were supposed to do, as far as I can tell, was collect. The Earth's electromagnetic field is not passive. It carries energy. The differential between the ground surface and the upper atmosphere represents an enormous reservoir of electrical potential that exists continuously, independently of weather, independently of sunlight, independently of any fuel source. A properly designed conductor, tall enough to reach into the higher charge layers and grounded deeply enough to complete the circuit, can draw from that reservoir the way a well draws from an aquifer. The building is the well. The spire is the shaft. The deep copper grounding system is the pump. And every single one of those buildings had all three components built in from the foundation up before a single room was furnished or a single door was hung. That realization changed how I looked at every photograph I had, because suddenly those spires weren't decorative anymore. They were the visible part of something much larger that extended deep underground. And the fact that they were built this way across so many structures in so many places meant that whoever was designing and constructing these buildings understood exactly what they were building and why. This was not accidental sophistication. This was applied knowledge, systematically deployed at scale, which raised a question that I could not shake. If the knowledge existed, if it was clearly being used, then somewhere there had to be a record of someone explaining it, a paper, a technical document, a correspondence, some artifact of the moment when this understanding was written down and communicated in plain language. And it turned out that artifact existed, one time, published once, cited never, and then buried so thoroughly that finding it felt less like research and more like archaeology. I found the paper late on a Tuesday evening. The archive room had long since closed, and I was working from a scanned copy on my screen, the kind of scan where the page edges are slightly curved, and you can see the ghost of the binding in the center margin. The author was an engineer named Callaway. The title was straightforward and technical. The content was anything but. Callaway had built working prototypes, small-scale versions of exactly the collection system I had been piecing together from architectural drawings and copper invoices. He had measured their output under different atmospheric conditions. He had documented voltage levels. He had calculated what a full-scale version, built into a properly designed structure, could produce on a continuous basis. The numbers were significant, not enormous by modern standards, but more than enough to supply a large building indefinitely, with no fuel, no combustion, no external supply of any kind. The schematics at the back of the paper were clean and detailed. Any competent engineer or skilled tradesman could have followed them. There was nothing exotic or inaccessible about the design. It was, in Callaway's own words, a straightforward application of principles that the Earth itself provides for free to anyone who builds the right structure to receive them. The paper was published in a respected scientific journal that had been printing research on atmospheric electricity and aerial conductor systems for over a decade before that issue. It was thorough. It was credible. It was exactly the kind of work that should have sparked a wave of follow-up research and public interest. Instead, Callaway submitted 2 follow-up papers the following year. Both were returned to him without review. The journal published nothing further in this area, ever. And in its annual report a few years later, the editorial board noted that atmospheric electricity collection had been, in their exact words, sufficiently explored and offered no further commercial applications. Not scientific applications, commercial ones. Someone at that journal had decided, at precisely the moment the technology became practically viable, that the correct response was to close the door. And when I looked at who was funding that journal's operations during those years and who sat on its advisory board, the names that came up were not scientists. They were industrialists, men who had built their fortunes on selling something that Callaway's paper suggested the world might not actually need to buy. Every single removal order said the same thing, not similar things, the same thing. Word for word, across dozens of cities, issued by departments that had no documented communication with each other. And when I finally understood what that meant, I had to close my laptop and just sit in the dark for a while. The removal permits I had been collecting were not just a pattern. They were a script. Someone had written the language, and someone had distributed it, and building departments across the country had copied it into their official records as if it were their own independent conclusion. The phrase that kept appearing, unauthorized resonance infrastructure, was not bureaucratic language that different officials would arrive at separately. It is too specific, too technical, Too precise for a coincidence. Someone composed that phrase deliberately and then made sure it appeared in the right documents in the right cities at the right time. The orders were funded by a National Fire Underwriters Association, an organization that most people have never heard of, but that effectively controlled building codes and insurance rates for the entire country during that period. In the middle of the spire removal wave, this association published a formal bulletin. I found a copy of it in a legal archive, tucked inside a larger file on building code litigation. The bulletin claimed that metal spire systems on commercial and residential buildings posed an unacceptable fire risk due to their tendency to attract lightning strikes. I read that claim. Then I read the data they attached to support it. Their own data contradicted them completely. In the years leading up to the bulletin, there were fewer than 25 documented cases of lightning-related fires in buildings with grounded spire systems across the entire country. In the same period, buildings without spire systems had thousands of fire incidents. The spires were not causing fires. Grounded conductors channel electrical discharge safely into the earth. That is basic physics. That is not controversial. The association's own numbers proved that buildings with spires were dramatically safer, and they published the bulletin anyway. I sat with that for a long time, because this is not a minor error in judgment. This is not an organization getting the science slightly wrong. This is a national body publishing a document that directly contradicts its own supporting evidence, then using that document to compel the removal of safety infrastructure from thousands of buildings. And the enforcement mechanism they used was ruthlessly effective. Any building that refused to comply faced insurance premium increases so extreme that most owners simply could not absorb them. Some faced outright policy cancellations. The message was clear, and it was not subtle. Remove the spires or lose your coverage. And within 18 months of each removal, the same buildings received conventional electrical installations, metered systems, systems that required a licensed provider, a monthly account, a permanent financial relationship with a utility company. The sequence was identical everywhere I looked. Take out the old system, put in the new one, bill forever. That is not safety regulation. That is a transition plan. But here is where the story gets a layer darker, because I had been focused on the buildings and the permits and the policy. I had not yet looked hard enough at what happened to the material itself once it was removed. And when I did, the picture shifted in a way I was not expecting. The copper did not go to scrap yards. It did not re-enter the commodity market. In city after city, the removal contracts specified that all excavated copper grounding systems were to be transported to designated collection facilities under supervised conditions. The buyers listed in the contracts were either unnamed or identified only by reference numbers that traced back to dead ends in procurement records. In one city, I found a partial paper trail that led to a government-adjacent contractor whose primary business was listed simply as materials processing. No further detail. No public filings. Across all the cities I was able to document, the total weight of copper removed and effectively disappeared from public markets runs into the hundreds of tons. Refined, precision-graded copper conductor cable, the kind that takes significant industrial effort to produce, gone. You do not supervise the transport of scrap metal. You do not route it through undisclosed contractors and prohibit its resale for decades if it is just waste material from outdated decorations. You do that when the material carries information. When the specifications and configurations of that copper tell a story you do not want anyone reading. When someone with the right knowledge could look at the gauge, the layout, the depth measurements stamped into the cable markings, and reconstruct exactly what the system was doing. They were not collecting copper, they were collecting evidence. And the thoroughness with which they did it tells you everything about how well the system had been working. Because you do not erase proof of something that never functioned. You erase proof of something that worked exactly as intended. And the deeper I went into the procurement records, the more I kept circling back to the same small cluster of names. Not city officials, not engineers. Industrialists. The same industrialists whose names had appeared on the advisory board of the journal that buried Callaway's paper. The same men who were building national electrical utility networks at exactly that moment. The same men who needed, above everything else, for the public to believe that electricity was not something you could gather from the air and the ground beneath your feet, that it was something you had to buy from them. Every single month, for the rest of your life. More than 30 researchers working on atmospheric energy collection lost everything they had built, and not one of them was ever charged with a crime. Think about what that means. If the work was fraudulent, you charge them with fraud. If the devices were dangerous, you charge them with endangerment. You do not simply walk into a man's workshop, take everything, and leave without a word, unless what you are taking is something that actually works. I built a list. It took me several weeks because the cases were scattered across decades and across different categories of record: lab fire reports, patent office correspondence, newspaper items that were small and buried and easy to miss, personal letters that ended up in university collections. I cross-referenced everything I could find, and what emerged was not a collection of isolated misfortunes. It was a sequence with a shape. The shape was always the same. A researcher develops a working system for collecting ambient or atmospheric energy. They demonstrate it. The demonstration is credible enough to attract serious attention, sometimes from well-known public figures, sometimes from engineers with established reputations who confirm that what they are seeing is real. The researcher files for patents or prepares to publish. And then something happens. The lab burns. The equipment is confiscated by officials who produce credentials but do not produce charges. The researcher is visited by men who suggest firmly that the work should stop. Sometimes the researcher stops, sometimes they try to continue. The ones who try to continue tend to experience the same sequence a second time, and occasionally a third. One man I found in the records had his prototype destroyed twice, and his notes seized once. He rebuilt from memory each time. He never stopped. He also never succeeded in getting his work into public hands. He spent the last years of his life writing detailed letters to anyone he thought might listen, describing what his device did and how it worked, trying to get the information out through sheer volume of correspondence before it could be taken again. Most of those letters went unanswered. A handful survived in archive collections, where they sat for decades being cataloged as the writings of an eccentric. Reading those letters was one of the stranger experiences of this whole process, because the man was not eccentric. He was methodical. He was precise. He described his measurements with the kind of careful detail you only develop through years of disciplined experimental work. And he was clearly terrified, not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet way of someone who has had concrete things taken from them by people with real authority and has understood, from that experience, exactly what he is dealing with. What struck me most was a line near the end of one letter, where he wrote that the hardest part was not the loss of the equipment. It was the realization that the resistance he was encountering was not bureaucratic. It was not ignorance. It was informed. The people who came for his work knew exactly what they were taking and why. They had looked at his prototypes and understood them. And that meant the knowledge he was trying to protect was not lost on the other side. It was simply being kept on the other side, away from everyone else. I kept thinking about that line as I moved into the next layer of the story, because it pointed at something I had been circling around without fully naming. This was not a campaign to suppress technology that powerful people did not understand. It was a campaign to suppress technology that powerful people understood very well. The difference matters enormously. Ignorance can be corrected. Informed suppression is a choice. And the choice had a very clear financial logic behind it, which brings me to the part of this story that I find the most difficult to sit with, because it is the part that is the least abstract. It is not about old buildings or archived patents or researchers from a previous century. It is about the infrastructure of daily life that every person reading this right now depends on completely, and why that dependency was engineered rather than inevitable. By the time the Spire removal campaign was in full force and Callaway's paper had been quietly shelved and researchers like the letter writer were being systematically shut down, the major electrical utility companies were in the middle of the most significant expansion in their history. They were laying the infrastructure for centralized power grids, cables under streets, transformer stations in neighborhoods, metering systems on every building. An enormous capital investment that only made financial sense if the people connected to that grid had no alternative, if they stayed connected, if they kept paying, every month, without interruption, for generations. I found an internal memo from one of the dominant utility companies of that era. It had been partially reproduced in a trade publication decades later as a historical curiosity, the kind of item that gets a paragraph and a mildly amused tone and is then forgotten. But the content of that memo was not a curiosity. It was a strategy document, and it identified decentralized ambient energy systems, in those exact words, as the primary competitive threat to the grid model. The memo recommended a specific approach: fund the regulatory commissions that issue electrical generation licenses. Set the licensing fees at levels that make independent generation economically unviable for ordinary people or small businesses. Attach compliance conditions that guarantee failure, even for those who can afford the initial cost. Make the path to energy independence so expensive and so legally complicated that it effectively does not exist. Within a few years of that memo, those recommendations were law in the majority of the country. Generating your own electricity without a utility-issued permit became a finable offense in most cities. The permits were structured to be practically unattainable. The conditions attached to them were designed not to regulate, but to exclude. And the commissions that issued them were funded directly or indirectly by the same companies that had the most to lose from anyone successfully stepping outside the grid. It was not regulation, it was a fence. A legal fence built around a resource that belonged to everyone to ensure that everyone had to pay for access to it through a single gate controlled by a small number of very wealthy men. And here's the thing about a fence that has been standing for long enough. After a generation or two, people stop noticing it. They stop wondering what is on the other side. They stop remembering that the fence was built by someone, for a reason, at a specific moment in history. It just becomes the shape of the world. And that is exactly what happened. The proof was never fully destroyed. That is the part they got wrong. You can remove the spires, confiscate the copper, reject the papers, and shut down every researcher who gets too close, but you cannot unbuild a foundation. And the foundations are still there, underneath buildings that millions of people walk past every single day without the faintest idea what is sitting below their feet. I want to tell you about the afternoon I spent in the archive room of a civic building that was constructed in the middle of the 19th century and is still standing. I had requested access to the original engineering specifications through a historical preservation inquiry, the kind of request that takes weeks to process and results in someone handing you a box of brittle documents in a room with no windows and a door that clicks shut behind you with a sound that feels very final. The specifications were detailed. Whoever drew them up knew exactly what they were building and documented it with the kind of precision that suggested they expected these documents to be used by future engineers who would need to understand the system completely. And buried in the foundation section, past the load calculations and the drainage plans, was a subsection labeled Collection and Distribution Interface. Not lightning protection, not grounding for safety. Collection and Distribution Interface. The copper array described in that subsection extended nearly 100 feet below street level. The building sits on solid bedrock at a fraction of that depth. There is no structural reason for anything to go deeper. The official note in the margin of that section, added in a different hand and a different ink that suggested it was written years after the original document, said simply, "Soil stabilization measure, but the building sits on rock. You do not stabilize rock with copper plates arranged in geometric patterns 90 feet underground." I sat in that archive room for a long time with those blueprints in front of me. The paper was so old it felt slightly soft at the edges, like it was slowly returning to something. The room smelled of dust and old ink and the particular stillness that collects in places where important things have been quietly forgotten. And I kept thinking about the engineer who drew these plans. He knew what this was. He documented it clearly and honestly. And then someone came along later and wrote soil stabilization in the margin, and that two-word lie has been sitting on top of the truth ever since. And nobody questioned it because nobody was looking. That is the mechanism. That is how it works. You do not need to destroy every document. You just need to add a convincing explanation on top of it, and then make sure that the generation doing the looking has already been taught what to expect to find. When you expect to find foundations, you find foundations. You do not see the collection and distribution interface sitting right there in the original text, because the margin note has already told your brain what it is looking at. I took photographs of every page. My hands were steady, but something in my chest was not. Because this building is not unique. I had found references to similar foundation specifications in at least a dozen other structures from the same era. I had only personally accessed this one, but the pattern was consistent enough that I was no longer in any doubt about what I was looking at across all of them. The fence that was built around this technology was not made of locks and walls. It was made of language. Soil stabilization, obsolete infrastructure, decorative flourish, aesthetic update. Each of those phrases is a brick in a wall that was constructed not to keep something out but to keep something in, to keep a specific understanding of the world from escaping into general awareness. And it worked. It worked for over a century. But here is what I came to understand sitting in that archive room with those blueprints. A wall made of language has a weakness that a wall made of stone does not. Stone does not care whether you understand it. Language requires you to accept it. And the moment you stop accepting the margin note and go back to reading the original text, the wall stops working. It does not crumble dramatically. It just becomes visible for what it is. Words on top of words. An explanation placed over a fact. And the fact underneath is still exactly what it always was. The original text of those blueprints said, collection and distribution interface. That is what was built. That is what was removed. And that is what every smooth, flat, modern rooftop you have ever looked at used to have, before someone decided that the people living and working in those buildings should pay for what those buildings had once been able to gather for free. The world we live in now, where energy is something you subscribe to, something that arrives through a wire from a source you will never see and could never replicate on your own, that world was not inevitable. It was chosen. Chosen by a small number of people who looked at a technology that worked, understood exactly what it would mean for their business model if it became widely available, and then spent enormous resources making sure it never did. They removed the spires. They buried the papers. They took the copper and made it disappear. They wrote margin notes over original specifications and funded the commissions that made independence illegal. And then they waited for the generation that remembered what had existed to die off, leaving behind a world that had no memory of the alternative. What I keep coming back to is this. Every person who has ever paid an energy bill has been paying for something that was deliberately taken from them before they were born. Not by accident, not through the natural march of progress, but through a series of calculated decisions made by people who are long dead and whose names most of us have never heard. The debt is invisible because the thing it replaced is invisible. You cannot miss what you never knew you had. But now you know it existed, and that changes something. Not immediately, not in a way that shows up on your next bill, but in the way you look at an old building the next time you walk past one, in the way you notice the bare roofline and understand, maybe for the first time, that the smoothness up there is not the natural shape of things. It is the result of a decision, and decisions made by people can be understood by people, examined by people, and eventually, in ways that take longer than any of us would like, answered by people. The technology was real. The suppression was real. The evidence is still sitting in public archives in cities all over the world, waiting for anyone willing to read the original text instead of the margin note. So here is the question I want to leave you with. If the founders of the modern energy industry were willing to go this far, removing infrastructure from thousands of buildings, burying working research, taking apart the work of independent inventors piece by piece, all to protect a business model. What does that tell you about what might be happening right now, today, with energy technologies that we are currently being told are not viable, not ready, not practical? Who is writing the margin notes this time, and who benefits from you believing them? If this made you think differently about something you walk past every day, leave a comment below. I genuinely want to know what you think and whether any of this connects to something you have noticed yourself. And if you want to keep going down this road with me, subscribe and leave a like. It is the simplest way to make sure the next part of the story reaches you.